All right. Thank you so much, James. Good afternoon. My name is Robert Trent Vinson. I'm the director and chair of the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. Today, it is my great honor to kick off our annual Meet the Fellows event. Today, our 8 predoctoral fellows and 6 postdoctoral fellows across a range of disciplines and theoretical perspectives, all doing research and writing in ways that center the historical and contemporary experiences of Black people across time and space. These extraordinary scholars will share just a snippet, just a teaser of their fascinating research. And I know there will be many opportunities across the year to engage them, to talk more, to workshop with them, to commune with them. I'm very excited to be able to be a part of this wonderful event. But before I go any further, I want to first thank the Woodson staff, Debbie Best, James Perla, and Randy Swift, our students who work in the office, Malachi Porter and Daniel Sawyer, and everyone else who helped make this event possible. It would not have happened without you, so thank you. And we have to, of course, acknowledge too that this year is a very special year. It marks the 40th anniversary of the Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. And in our 40th year, we're going to have some commemorative events. And so I asked that you save the dates for 2 major upcoming events that you'll want to be a part of. Thursday, October 21st, from 4:30 to 6, we will have a reception. The Woodson will hold a reception and host that reception called Global Black Studies Across Grounds. And we'll hold this, and there'll be more information coming out. But this is an opportunity for an additional opportunity for the UVA community and beyond to interact with our wonderful faculty and our fellows and our students. So please save the date, Thursday, October 21st, for that reception that the Woodson will host, Global Black Studies Across Grounds, and it will be in an indoor-outdoor space now in Gibson. So for those of us who are understandably still concerned about the COVID pandemic, there is an opportunity to be outside and of course be masked as well. So that's the first date that I ask that you mark your calendars. And the second date to mark on the calendar is Thursday evening, December 9th, from 6:30 to 9 p.m. And on that special evening, we are going to have an official celebration of the Woodson's 40th anniversary. And I won't spoil all the details, but it's going to be an extraordinary program. You're going to want to be there for this. And this program will be virtual, but I promise you, this will be something that you will not want to miss. And so as we celebrate this 40th year, the Woodson has grown tremendously since its founding in 1981. Right? The founding director, Armstead Robinson, established the first program in African American Studies in Virginia in 1981. And that was one part of the charge. The other part of the charge was to establish a research center dedicated to the study of African Americans. And in these 40 years, with Professor Robinson and subsequent directors, Reginald Butler, Deborah McDowell, and interim directors, Scott French and Cindy Hola-Fatan, the program that Dr. Robinson started in 1981 has grown to be a department with 14 full-time faculty members. We have expanded our thematic and chronological and geographical scope to still, of course, look at the African American experience in all of its dimensions, but to be more global, to really engage in the histories and the studies of Africa and the many African diasporas across time and space. So as we've expanded and grown, we are so proud in this 40th year to celebrate the crown jewel of the Woodson. We are a wonderful department. We have a wonderful curriculum mission. We do wonderful community service. And we'll talk much more about that in the coming events that I mentioned already. But I think it's understood by many far and wide that the unquestioned crown jewel of the Woodson Institute is our 40-year fellows program. The fellows that you'll be engaging with in a few minutes are part of a 40-year lineage of fellows who have gone on to win all the major book prizes, all the major fellowships, who have been placed at the top universities, have become institutional leaders, and have defined many, many fields along the way. That is a whole seminar in and of itself, but the receipts are readily available, as our former director, Deborah McDowell, is fond of saying. I also want to give a special thanks to our former director, Deborah McDowell, because in her 13 years as director, she has presided over the transition from a program to a department, the great expansion of our fellows program, the great expansion of our curriculum mission, and our community service mission. So we owe a great deal of thanks to Professor McDowell. Quite literally, many of us would not be here without Professor McDowell. So without further ado, you didn't come to hear me talk. You want to hear these wonderful fellows talk. And I'm going to name them in alphabetical order. And I'll start with the pre-doctoral fellows. And they are Ashley Ngozi Agbasoga, Sean Armstead, Alicia Mancherry, Matthew Greer, Joao Batista Nascimento Greer, Zalika Ibrarimi, Jillian McCommons, and Abraham Seta. And also going in alphabetical order, our postdoctoral fellows are Mahalia Little, Janae Moses, Jamie Parker, Nicole Ramsey, Alexandria Smith, and Brian Smithson. So what we will do, our format, and you can reference the program, our format will go as this. I will introduce the first pre-doctoral fellow going in alphabetical order, Ashley Ngozi Agbasoga. She will offer her 5-minute presentation, and then she will introduce the next fellow, and we will keep going down in that order until we finally come to the end, and then there will be a time for some Q&A. And so that's where we're going and what we're doing, and I can't wait to get started. So without further ado, let me introduce our first pre-doctoral fellow, Ashley Ngozi Agbasoga, anthropology PhD candidate at Northwestern University. Take it away, Ashley.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Vincent, for introducing me. As he said, my name is Ashley Ngozi Agbasoga, and I'm a second-year Woodson pre-doctoral fellow. I'm also a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology with a certificate in Black Studies, as well as a Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies fellow at Northwestern University. Before I begin, I would like to thank Dr. Vincent, Dr. McDowell, Miss Debbie, and everyone at the Woodson for this wonderful opportunity and the incredible support thus far. Let's get started, and I'm gonna start my timer. All right. In April of 2019, after nearly 2 centuries, the Mexican Senate voted unanimously to recognize Afro-Mexicans and its constitution as, quote, constitutive, of the nation, end quote. The year after, Afro-descendants were counted for the first time in Mexico's decennial census. Some organizations that center Afro-Mexican rights have celebrated this official recognition, official admission into the nation, others reluctantly so. Those with reservations about what such recognition could offer Black communities frequently cited the failed infrastructure, investments, and anti-discrimination projects that the Mexican government had promised and not delivered Indigenous communities since the 90s. During this wave of institutionalization of Blackness through the census, constitution, and other avenues, the Guardia Nacional, or in English, National Guard, was formed. Created as a coalition of the federal, military, and naval police forces, the Guardia Nacional wielded unprecedented powers under the guise of national security. The Guardia Nacional has already been cited for numerous brutalities, particularly along Mexico's southern border, against Black and African, Indigenous, and non-Black and Indigenous Central American migrants. And as y'all saw the last few weeks with Haitian migrants on the US-Mexico border, as well as US Border Patrol. How could Mexico instead extend rights to Black and Afro-descendant people, yet simultaneously oversee such horrors against Black Indigenous migrants? And How is this expressed through the continuous shaping of national territory? And in this current moment of recognition and institutionalization of Blackness and indigeneity, I ask, what are the terms and conditions under which Blackness is recognized by the state? And what happens with the impossibility of meeting the state's rubrics on inclusion into the mestizo state? What does it mean to insist and practice existence in a place that has denied your very existence for centuries, and to do it on your and your community's own terms? My dissertation, titled "We Dance with Existence, Black and Indigenous Placemaking in the Land Known as Mexico and Beyond," illuminates how Black, Indigenous, and Black and Afro-Indigenous women in Mexico engage in placemaking practices that reveal and unsettle notions of racialization, place, in the formation of the nation state. I examine the ways in which Black and Indigenous women's and queer collectives throughout Southern Mexico imagine themselves outside of the state's rubrics of inclusion and exclusion. I argue that Black Indigenous placemaking practices create two critical ruptures. First, in the reproduced bifurcation of Blackness and indigeneity, and second, in the Mexican state's racialization of its territory as mestizo. This project is centered around years of ethnographic work conducted from 2016 through this year. And as a trained anthropologist, I think with the ways that Black and Indigenous communities, particularly those who are gendered as women and non-binary, as well as those who are documented as Mexican nationals and migrants without documented Mexican citizenship, theorize the role that mestizaje plays in their everyday lives. Further, this project works in dialogue with past and emerging work that theorizes Black and Indigenous relation, as well as historical and contemporary critiques of mestizaje as central to understanding nation-state formation and violence throughout the Americas. This ethnographic work, in conjunction with archival work stemming from my training in archival processing and theory from the Newberry Library, form the basis of this project. I merge Black studies and Indigenous studies in this work, as it is crucial to understand the ongoing intimacies of race and space throughout Mexico's past and present. And in this project, I especially center the critical works of Black and Indigenous writers throughout the hemisphere. My motivation for this project is far and wide. It comes from many places, both personal and otherwise. At the basis of this project, and what keeps me and the communities going in this project, is the dream of liberation of Black and Indigenous peoples, not only in the land known as Mexico, but throughout the hemisphere and the globe. In order to combat the systems that we are all up against, we must understand how they work. This is the primary motivation of part of this project, to demonstrate in the ways in which modernity, colonialism, and coloniality, capitalism, and the different manifestations of multiculturalism and nation-state building projects have continued to result in continuing immeasurable violence against Black and Indigenous communities. As organizers, educators, and communities alike have already done, my hope is to continue conversation that imagine other worlds possible through the connections of our struggles and our own fashioning of our lives beyond borders. Until then, thank you. Mm-hmm. Now I'll be passing it over to, I had the program uploaded and now I can't find it. Okay, thanks, James. All right. And it won't open, of course. Okay, there we go. Okay. Now I'm going to introduce my esteemed colleague, Sean Armstead.
It would help if I unmuted myself. Hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by saying thank you for taking the time to attend this evening's event. I am thrilled to share a bit about my research and, well, me. I especially want to express my gratitude to the Carter G. Woodson Institute at UVA. In the mere 2 months since relocating to the Charlottesville area, I and my project have benefited from interactions with other fellows, as well as having the resources to devote the lion's share of my time to dissertating. To say I am excited for the months and years to come is an understatement. So in my dissertation, Imagine Solidarities, Black Liberal Internationalism and the National Accounts of Negro Women's Journey from Afro-Asian to Pan-African Unity, 1935 to 1975, I study women who hoped to change the world through recuperating liberalism so that its promises of individual rights extended beyond the white and often, though not always, male subject. Focusing on the National Council of Negro Women, an umbrella organization Mary McLeod Bethune founded in 1935, I examine efforts to work with both Asian and African women to realize these aims, concluding in 1975 with the United Nations International Women's Year. Central to my project is answering how Black women who were neither communists nor Black nationalists reimagined political ideas for the betterment of the world. I look at their efforts to unite with other women of color and how competing interests and a shifting geopolitical landscape, as well as preconceived notions of their political collaborators, shaped the possibilities and the limits of their international efforts. Building on scholarship on Black internationalism that centers radical thinkers, I contextualize these women in a legacy of efforts to establish a fairer world. Broadly speaking, animating my research is a desire to understand the ways Black folks, particularly Black women, imagine freedom through reform. I have learned from my research in organizational archives, personal papers, biographies, and oral histories, to name but a few sources, that women like Bethune, Sue Bailey Thurman, and Dorothy Farabee tenaciously pursued better worlds, balancing both desires to strengthen their claims to American identity with participating in Afro-Asian and Pan-African solidarities. From establishing scholarship programs, attempting to affiliate with other associations, to attending conferences both in and outside the American nation, they tried an array of strategies to create an alternative world to the one they knew. Admittedly, I find their ideas fascinating, though not without fault and unreconciled tensions. Their worldviews and global imaginings nonetheless display the rich complexities, dynamism, and nuance that reminds us yet again that the Black women's intellectual canon holds treasures for scholars and activists who wish to dream the world anew. Yet I must be honest here, I am a bit of a skeptic. Another driver of my examination of these women is that I personally can't imagine such hope, such confidence in being able to remake the world. In 2021, decades after these women flourished, the promise of the UN has gone largely unrealized. Warfare and oppressions like racism, sexism, transphobia, and Islamophobia, to name but a few, continue to thrive, making it hard for me to comprehend such hope under these conditions. But I want to. Our lamentable state of affairs, I believe, makes imperative that we revisit and meditate on the spectrum of Black international ideas and efforts. By studying the Council's internationalism, I hope to contribute to work that further illuminates possible liberatory avenues ahead. And on that note, it is my pleasure to introduce the next pre-doctoral fellow, Alicia Mancherry, who comes to us from the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that beautiful introduction and energy. And Ashley and Sean, it was beautiful to hear about your research. And thank you everyone for coming tonight, for being here and sharing a little bit of yourselves with us. And a special thank you as well to everyone who made it possible, this Meet the Fellows event to happen. I'm really excited to connect with folks and to learn with and from you all, and to just be in community and continue to build community through the Woodson. As Sean stated, my name is Alicia. I'm a second-year doctoral fellow here at the Woodson, and also a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago in the Political Science Department. And my dissertation takes an ethnographic look at an ethnographic community-based approach to studying state power, gendered racial violence, and community organizing in Brazil and Colombia. And I examine how Black women are creating networks of support and autonomous organizing by leading movements resisting violence against themselves, their care networks, and communities. And I argue that women are weaving together many different experiences with other Black women within and beyond local communities or territories. And in doing so are sharing and co-creating knowledge through meetings, articulations, and what bell hooks and Zintuzi Asoki call placemaking or homemaking, pushing how we think of a nation state apparatus into chaos, into crisis. And in centering the leadership of Black women, I argue that they're using a framework of intimacy to describe and respond and framed their experiences with state violence, with injustice, and other sort of forms of violations. And through this analysis, I underscore how language, lived experiences, and spaces of intimacy are shaping the content and the demands and actions of grassroots organizing. For example, I examine the ways that intimacy and activism intersect through emotions of joy, pain, anger, belonging, constructions of home, and the politicization of motherhood and care. And the project is interested in looking at how identity and affect alter the different fields and domains and spheres. Sorry, someone's at my door, so I'm like trying to stay focused and ignore it. So I'm interested in looking at how identity and affect alter the fields, domains, and spheres of Black politics that Black women pursue. And if intimacy is the lens through which these politics are being conceived, then how does an articulation of the intimate complicate our understanding and resistance to global white supremacy and anti-Blackness? And lastly, I'm interested in, my last question is, how do these politics destabilize existing legal advancements, structures, and norms regarding equality, inclusion, rights, and justice? And so, to answer these questions, my project brings together participatory, community-based, ethnographic, autoethnographic, and other qualitative methodologies. And I was able to collaborate with organizers to facilitate different workshops and healing circles, and co-create a political education school on art and activism and Afrofeminism. And these were spaces, methodologies that take a popular political education approach, and they were carried out with a group, anywhere from 12 to 70 women, mostly women. And some of the themes that we tackled were collective memory, documenting our own experiences as Black women, our experiences in understanding like protection, autonomous protection, safety, care, plant and herbal medicine, ancestral medicine, among others. And interviews that I was able to conduct largely explore things that emerged through previous interviews, such as the language of intimacy when describing encounters with state, and conceptions of what community reconciliation and safety and protection entail based on the perspectives, reflections, and experiences of Black women. And the oral history interviews are some of the sort of transformations of daily life as a result of state violence and organizers' conceptions of local and diasporic belonging and identities, and aspirations, and visions and dreams and intentions for the future of Black communities locally and diasporic. And my desire, motivation, is to really make connections to experiences and movements, organizations, and women, other women that I've had the privilege of working with. And one of the fundamental motivations of the project is to, like I said, kind of get people, communities, organizations connected and involved in the project as much as possible. And it's also just been really inspiring to see some of those legacies of the project already kind of coming into fruition. And so with that said, I will stop and pass the mic over to Matthew Greer, who I believe follows me, if my memory is correct. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alicia. I'd also like to thank Dr. Vincent, Dr. McDowell, James Perla, Debbie Best, and everyone else at the Woodson who made this event possible, and everyone out in the audience for showing up today. So again, my name is Matthew Greer, and I am a second-year predoctoral fellow at the Woodson and a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Syracuse University. I'm an archaeologist, and my research focuses on the lives of enslaved people in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley is a region where scholars have long argued that slavery didn't really exist. And it wasn't until the 1990s that historians began studying how the institution operated in the region. Unfortunately, most of the dozen or so studies on slavery in the Valley predominantly focus on the institution writ large and how it affected the lives of white families in the region, which generally leaves out the stories of the women, children, and men enslaved in the Valley. My dissertation attempts to study these people's lives and to write enslaved people back into the history of the Shenandoah Valley. And I do this by addressing two interrelated questions. The first one is, what was life like for those enslaved in the region? And second, how did enslaved people come to shape the history of the Shenandoah Valley? And how did their actions help create the region as we know it today? I answer these using information from an enslaved quartering site at Belgrove Plantation in Frederick County, where I directed excavations between 2015 and 2019. We currently have a team of researchers studying different aspects of the site, but my specific research focuses on analyzing the ceramics that we found to figure out what types of vessels enslaved people owned, how they used them, and where they may have gone to buy them. I also study the layout of the plantation landscape and how enslaved people found ways to carve out spaces for themselves within it. To round out my work, I conducted documentary research at local archives, focusing mostly on early 19th century newspapers and merchants' ledgers. So for a quick example of how all this comes together, enslaved people in the region often grew and raised food for themselves to supplement the inadequate rations that their enslavers gave them. And when they managed to have more food than they needed, many chose to sell it to make money for themselves. With this money, many people enslaved at Belle Grove bought ceramic storage vessels from local potters. And these are essentially the Tupperware or the mason jar of the early 19th century. By comparing the types of storage vessels bought by enslaved and white consumers, we can tell that enslaved people bought different types of vessels because they were storing different types of food and practicing their own culinary traditions. These vessels also allowed enslaved people to store food for the winter when they could not count on fresh produce to supplement their rations. Based on the evidence from Belle Grove, enslaved people bought a significant number of ceramic storage vessels from local potters. And their actions as consumers helped shape the Shenandoah Valley's local ceramic industry, which disproves long-held views that local pots were made only by white people and only for white people. To theorize the lives of enslaved women and men and children in the Shenandoah Valley, I draw on three bodies of literature. The first is studies of materiality that come out of archaeology, and these focus on how everyday things in the past affected people's lives. The second is assemblage theory, especially the work of Gilles Deleuze, Edouard Glissant, and Antonio Benitez Rojo. And the third is Black studies, especially the work of Sylvia Wynter, Saidiya Hartman, and Tiffany King. These three strands of theory have not been used in conjunction with one another before, and I argue that doing so can push archaeology and African diaspora studies in new directions. Bringing Black studies into archaeology forces us to grapple in meaningful ways with how slavery and 19th century ideas about race work together to deny the humanity of enslaved people. It also provides us with new ways of thinking about how enslaved people found ways to make lives for themselves by redefining themselves as human beings. Bringing materiality into Black studies at the same time lets us see how everyday objects like bricks and stones and cornmeal helped enslavers to create their ideas about race. It also lets us see how equally mundane things like ceramics and chickens and brooms allowed enslaved people to make lives for themselves. And finally, to make sure that the findings of my project don't just live in a dissertation, I'm co-directing the creation of a museum exhibit on enslaved life, which will be installed at Belle Grove Plantation, so that visitors to the museum can learn what life was like for enslaved people in the Shenandoah Valley and how their actions helped create the region as we know it today. And we are hoping that this exhibit will be installed and open to the public by March, but fingers crossed on that. All right, and with that, it is my pleasure to pass things over to Joao Batista Nascimento Gregory, who is from the Department of History at the University of Kansas.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you for being here. So my name is Joao Batista Nascimento Gregory. I am from Brazil, so I know that my first name can be a little difficult to pronounce, so I also go by Joe. Feel free to call me Joe. And the title of my dissertation is Fighting the Myth of Racial Democracy from Within, Black Political Action in Brazil from mid-1970s to early 2000s. My project basically reconstructs the story of how Afro-Brazilians demanded greater political participation and state institution inclusion during the political transition from military dictatorship to democracy. Brazil had a military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. My project argues that Black political action was pivotal to the enactment of revolutionary ethno-racial policies that have been implemented in the past few decades in Brazil. By doing that, I shift the focus from the federal government, which has been largely credited as the main responsible for the enactment of these policies, and I place the origins of these race-based reforms within the realm of Black politics. Something important about these race-based reforms is that they constitute the first signs of disruption of this very powerful state and civil society sponsored narrative, which is the concept of racial democracy. So everyone that studies race in Brazil is faced with this concept, which argues that Brazilians are not, Afro-Brazilians were not subject to racism or racial discrimination. Two very important questions that are addressed in my dissertation are how these Black political agents mobilized to redefine their roles in Brazilian society by turning the political sphere into their main ground of contestation. And once they carve out a place in formal politics, how they deployed unprecedented access to institutional resources and political power to address the issues of racism and racial discrimination. So something important about my research is that I'm engaging with this very still underdeveloped emerging field of Afro-Brazilian politics. While the contribution of Afro-Brazilians to the cultural realm has been largely acknowledged by Brazilian society at large or by the specialized scholarship, and this has also been used as one of the ways to validate the alleged existence of racial democracy in Brazil. For example, it's very common for Brazilians to claim their African heritage just by stating that they all listen to samba, or they eat Afro-Brazilian dishes, or they are proud of Afro-Brazilians playing in the national soccer team, for example. But there is very little there's very little studies showing that Afro-Brazilians, their contribution to the Brazilian society transcends the cultural realm. So I hope that my dissertation, by demonstrating that Black Afro-Brazilians were extremely important political agents, I'm hoping that this topic of Afro-Brazilian politics will deserve more scholarly attention. I draw heavily on oral history, and even in the testimonies of important Afro-Brazilian leaders that I interviewed, they mentioned that first their main referential of struggle was the Black movement, the Black Power movement in the United States, or the Civil Rights movement, and also the liberation movement in Africa, stating that how difficult it was to have any referential of struggle in Brazil because of the lack of studies that showing that Afro-Brazilians had been operating within the realm of formal politics since the 1930s at least. And also I'd like to finish on a more personal level. I'd like to take this opportunity here to express how happy I am to be here. I will never forget when I got back home and I saw there was a phone call from Virginia. I immediately thought there was I had forgotten to submit a document to complete my application, and it was Professor McDowell telling me that I had been accepted into the program. I was speechless. This was always my dream scholarship. And I knew how important the work that the Institute does, how respected it is. So I feel extremely fortunate to be part of this community. And now I'd like to introduce my dear colleague, Zalika Ibrarimi. She is a PhD candidate in the African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you.
Thank you, Joao, so much for that warm greeting and a welcome and introduction. Greetings, everyone. My name is Zalika Ibrarimi, and I'm a multidisciplinary artist, doctoral candidate in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at UT Austin. I'm incredibly grateful for the Woodson, my advisor, colleagues, family, comrades, and friends. My dissertation, Haunted Femmes, Haunting Spectators, Modalities of Black Desire, Pleasure, and Sexual Shame, examines what Black intracommunal material and digital publics believe it knows as spectators of the deviant Black femme. My dissertation analyzes the literary work Sula, written by Toni Morrison, the work of visual artist and sculptor Doreen Garner, the performance art of Adrian Piper, the work of trans femme performance artist Emma Sokovitz, the interviews of Black trans ballroom icon Octavia St. Laurent and former erotic performer Asia Zola Wells' Twitter thread known as The Story or The Thoughtacy. I place these creative works in conversation with the lives of those no longer living, such as Billie Holiday, Lisa Left Eye Lopez, Kanika Jenkins, Islan Nettles, Angelia Mangum, and Chidisha Ball. My work argues that Black migratory and Mid-Atlantic grammar foster queered quotidian understandings of Black deviant identities that are enacted by the femme. Furthermore, by analyzing shame, this study interrogates ways of knowing Black femme desire and pleasure that are rendered inaccessible to publics. I use a Black queer feminist method of research creation through critical performance, visual, sonic, and textual analysis. My key research questions ask, how are geographies of the sexually shamed Black femme mapped within material and digital spheres? What ways do digital publics make known the desires of the Black femme that are rendered inaccessible to Black spectators? How can social media as a visual practice for sexually shamed Black femme subjects unveil the digital intimacies relayed within the selfie? And this is like a twofold question. The second part is considering the private performance to the public circulation of images. What are the distinctions and commonalities between the selfie and self-portrait, the artist and image maker? And the last question is, how are the entrapments of desirability enacted by Black femmes and their intramural spectators with the spectral presence of anti-Blackness? I employ four Black queer feminist methods of analysis through the critical visual, sonic, performatic, and the textual within the direction of research creation. It is critical to the study to name the mediums of all objects of analysis. The objects of analysis consist of a sculpture, a video performance that was distributed online, embodied performances of the living and dead, photographic performances of both selfies and self-portraits, a series of tweets of analysis, and performances from spectators online and the circulation of rumors to digital publics. My use of these methods comes with an understanding that some objects of analysis will require all four analyses by way of research creation. Engaging plasticity on terms that are destabilizing, often disruptive to systems of power and the ways in which it is both conceptual and literal. Open quote, plasticity indicates the means by which bodies absorb the impact of their environments and resist calcification, unquote. I recognize the generative capacities of malleability for Black performance. Considering objecthood and plasticity, performance is a methodological enactment designed to facilitate my own processes for the development of theory that engages onto otherwise notions of Black sexually deviant thingness, personhood, and geography. This process is a meta method of research creation that I term Black ontoplasticity. Black ontoplasticity pulsates throughout all chapters as a means to honor the rhizomatic properties found within the discourses of each chapter. One of the interventions that I make in the study is the centering of Philadelphia's language as a site to explore how shame and desire permeate the ontology of the Black femme figure. Another intervention includes a study of what I recognize as the ontology of the Black whore body, as I argue that the entrapments of desire architect both possibility and horror. Haunted Femmes Haunting Spectators explores how outcasted Black femmes create their own logics and knowledge production through unique modes of being. This dissertation is a way to build on Black theories and methods within the field of Black studies by specifically engaging the study of visual culture, art and performance, Black sexual logics, Black queer theory, Black digital intimacy, Black porn and sex work studies, sonic studies, experimental methods, Black ontologies, and Black geographies. Thank you for listening. And next, Jillian McCommons from the University of Kentucky, Department of History, will discuss her project.
Thank you so much, Zalika. I'm just like over here like, yes, yes, yes. It's good to be in community with all of you. I am very glad to be a Woodson Fellow. This is my second year, and I'm thankful for the community and the huge help this has been for me to push forward my work and think in new and better directions. I'm going to share my screen. I want to show an image while I tell you about my work. Okay, so my name is Jillian McCommons. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at the University of Kentucky. My dissertation is entitled The Black Appalachian Commission, Regional Black Power Politics and the War on Poverty, 1969 to 1975. My research is concerned with two questions. What does Black consciousness look like in Appalachia? And how might the history of Black Appalachian activism change what we know about Black power? I explore these questions through the history of the Black Appalachian Commission, the BAC, a grassroots organization founded in 1969 by Black student activists from Berea College in Kentucky. By its end in 1975, the BAC was an independent organization headquartered in Atlanta and led by community activists. The BAC's use of Black Appalachian is the first instance of the term I found in the historical record. The term is more than a simple way of referring to African-American residents of the region. It represents a historical moment in which the Black Power movement, part of the larger Black freedom struggle, coalesced with Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty in the Appalachian South. The BAC made a regional call for solidarity amongst Black people during what historian Rhonda Y. Williams identifies as the era of expansive Black power. They organized into an institution, challenged and proposed new federal policies, and supported Black communities throughout Appalachia in their fight for justice. This included economic, racial, and environmental justice. One example I discuss is the work the BAC did to support a community of residents during the Sanctified Hill disaster in 1972 in Cumberland, Kentucky, when Black working class residents lost their homes to mudslides. Here I engaged theories of Black geographies by Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods, and Black ecology by Justin Hosby and J.T. Rohn. My research highlights the intersections of Black power studies and Appalachian studies by examining Black Appalachian demands for structural change during the War on Poverty through Richard Nixon's subsequent dismantling of liberal policies after 1972. Although ultimately limited by the unwillingness of federal agencies to adopt their demands, the BAC harnessed the openings of the War on Poverty to challenge racism in the Appalachian region. Their radical vision of anti-poverty was to address it through anti-racism. My project is divided into two parts. The first includes a discussion of the background of the BAC founders, the organization's origin story, and issues of identity and Black regional consciousness. The second part outlines the change that happens when community activists take the helm, specifically how they challenged public policy and supported individual communities on the ground. I use oral histories government documents, and sources from the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, Berea College Archives, and the personal collections of participants. I hope my dissertation will help to spark more conversations on Black activism in Appalachia, Black rural histories, and Black regional identities. I see my work as part of the project to highlight differences in the Black American experience and larger conversations on Blackness, social justice, and environmental justice throughout the African diaspora. So this is an image from the BAC's first conference in 1971. I wanted to show you their program from the conference. The conference was in Black Mountain, North Carolina. And a really important thing is they wanted to show attendees to the conference the numbers of Black people in the region. First, the region itself, which you see on the map, these 13 states that are included, but also how many Black people were there. So this was their way of dispelling the myth of Appalachia as an all-white region. And it also was a way, the first way for them to start to call for regional solidarity amongst Black people in order to build a mass movement to challenge racism. So thank you for your attention. It's nice to meet everyone. And I'd like to introduce Abraham Seta, a doctoral candidate in history from the University of Minnesota.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jillian, for the introduction. So my name is Abraham Seta. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Minnesota and a first-year pre-doc at the Woodson Institute. And the title of my dissertation is A Contested Ring, African Boxing, Social Control and Subversive Culture in Colonial Zimbabwe. So I'm particularly interested in boxing because compared to other sports that became very popular across the British Empire, boxing was very different. You could reasonably make a case for why cricket, soccer, or other imperial games were used for purposes of subject formation and social control. But that case is much more difficult to make when it comes to boxing. Some commentators have even described boxing as legalized assault. So in the first decade of colonization in Zimbabwe, in 1890, colonial settlers argued that boxing was actually good for colonized Africans and that it could be weaponized to discipline them. And it could provide them with a space in which Africans could express their aggression. So they continued to encourage boxing, but within a very short space of time, they recognized that African boxing did not abide by the conventions of Western-style boxing, particularly the Queensberry rules. So one of the central tenets of the Queensberry rules is that, for example, you cannot hit below the belt, you cannot hit a man when he's down. But in the context of African boxing, this is exactly what was happening. Africans were drinking beer at boxing matches, they were smoking marijuana, and they basically decided that they had to stop African boxing. One of the central arguments that I make in my dissertation is that for Africans, boxing provided a platform where they could organize politically. It provided them with a space for anti-colonial expression. It provided them with a space for cultural expression as well. And one of the significant appropriations that Africans did to Western-style boxing was the introduction of indigenous medicines as performance-enhancing substances. And the colonial government basically responded by dismissing these medicines as superstitions. But while the colonial government had made these dismissals, African boxers believed that these medicines protected them from harm. They made them invincible within the boxing ring. So one of the earlier contradictions that you see is that the colonial government is on one hand arguing that these medicines are superstitions, but at the same time, they were actively trying to find ways of undermining the substance and how it was being used by Africans. So they started using different regulations, particularly the Witchcraft and Suppression Act, which was crafted in 1910. The law basically criminalized all acts of healing that were not recognized in the canons of Western medicine. Boxing in colonial Zimbabwe was also closely tied to South Africa and later on apartheid South Africa. Historically, boxing has always been tied to ideas of white racial superiority. And up until 1907, Black people were not allowed to compete for the world heavyweight title. It was only in 1907 that Jack Johnson became the first African-American to win the world heavyweight title. And in the United States, there were riots, there was violence, and people were arguing that we need to remind Black people of their position in society. Part of the reason why you see such reactions is because boxing had always been created and framed as the manliest of all sports. So to have a Black person emerge as the manliest in such a context, it undermined many of the racial discourses that were so central to societies in Europe, North America, and settler societies in Africa. So 40 years after Jack Johnson becomes the world heavyweight champion, apartheid South Africa bans from circulation images that were associated with Jack Johnson. And this is despite the fact that Jack Johnson never set foot on the African continent. And at exactly the same time that the apartheid government had banned from circulation images that are associated with Jack Johnson, they're also working with colonial Zimbabwe to police African boxing, to regulate the circumstances under which Africans will be allowed to fight, particularly the issue of interracial fights. So in 1954, apartheid South Africa passes a law titled the Wrestling and Boxing Control Act, which basically centralized the control of boxing and, more importantly, banned interracial boxing. And within 2 years of that happening, colonial Zimbabwe passes an identical version of exactly the same law, also centralizing the control of the sport and banning interracial boxing. So you begin to see a transnational alliance between colonial Zimbabwe, apartheid South Africa, as well as South Africa's responses to the global ideas of racial superiority and the triumphs of prominent Black boxers. And this was all done in an attempt to police African boxers. And some of the key questions that I try to answer in my projects include what does an ideal colonial subject look like in the boxing ring? And in answering this question, I try to examine how the colonial subject was imagined, how the colonial state sought to discipline the colonial subject, even though they were using such a violent sport. And I also assess how other forms of colonial control intersected with the colonial control of African boxing. As I mentioned earlier on, the boxing ring becomes a contested site. It becomes a space where Africans congregate to drink beer, to smoke marijuana, to socialize. And as a result, it provides an outlet for Africans to express themselves. And because of that, the colonial government becomes very interested in policing what happens in the boxing ring and by extension within the broad African society. This research primarily relies on archives from the Escovitz Library of African Studies and the National Archives of Zimbabwe. And with that, I will introduce you to my colleague and the postdoc fellow, Mahalia Little.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Abraham. Thank you again to everyone for being here this evening. I am super excited to get together with everybody as a group and really, really invigorated by hearing about all of your research. So to begin with the introduction to my work, my project is titled Hushed Articulations, Theorizing Representations of Black Women's Post-Violence Sexuality. And it interrogates representations of Black women's sexuality in the aftermath of sexual violence, what I term post-violent sexuality. So following feminist and anti-rape activism of the 1970s and 80s, the prevalence and ramifications of sexual violence gained public, activist, and intellectual attention. However, neoliberal subject formation and entrenched public reliance on personal empowerment rather than social, political, or institutional intervention have converged and contributed to increasingly polarized conceptualizations of victimhood and survivorship in the 21st century. Black women's relationship to these post-violence identities is especially fraught. And Hushed Articulations intervenes in rape crisis and anti-rape feminist debates by considering Black women's specific cultural relationships to the prevailing linear conceptualization of trauma recovery that delineates transformation from victim to survivor, or discursively prioritizes survivor over victim when addressing people who have experienced sexual violence. So adding to a growing body of Black feminist literary and cultural criticism that theorizes the relationship between violence, autonomy, and Black women's sexuality, my project examines the murky overlap of arousal, trauma, and compulsory performative heroism in Black women's articulations of post-violent sexuality in order to demythologize both victimhood and survivorship. I argue that a fuller range of Black women's post-violent sexuality and possibility is represented in Black women's fiction and memoir, a range that is not reliant on dichotomized social constructions of victimhood and survivorship, and that other forms of media created for and about people who have experienced sexual violence often leave unacknowledged. So some of the sites that I look at in my work are two anthologies that were sort of defining anthologies in the field of Black women's sexuality studies, which were Charlotte Pierce Baker's anthology, Surviving the Silence, Black Women's Stories of Rape, and Trisha Rose's Longing to Tell, Black Women Talk About Sexuality and Intimacy. In addition to those, I look at Aisha Shadida Simmons' Know the Rape documentary, the Surviving R. Kelly series, as well as Roxane Gay's Hunger, A Memoir of My Body, and Gail Jones's Corregidor as examples of fiction that explores post-violent sexuality, but is not reliant on that dichotomized idea of victimhood and survivorship. And as a parting thought, when people describe having experienced a crime or having had been the victim of a crime, the victim of a car theft, the victim of vandalism, I really think long and hard about how there is no pressure to identify as a survivor of car theft or a survivor of any other sort of crime. And what is it about the stickiness, as Ariane Cruz would say, of sexual violence that creates the impetus or the motivation to declare verbally for others to observe your triumph over this particular kind of violation. So that is my research. And I will introduce my esteemed colleague, Janae Moses. I'm excited to hear about her work and everyone else's this evening. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mahalia. I so loved hearing about your work. I'm going to read so that I can better keep track of time. My book project, A House to Sing In, Extra/Ordinary Black Women's Narratives About Black Power, began 10 years ago. My undergraduate advisor, Ann Farnsworth Alvear, gently nudged me to take an experimental oral history seminar. She made oral history simple. Find a gap in an historical record and fill it with a voice. Later, as a Columbia Oral History Master's student, I sought out Amir Baraka, also known as Leroy Jones, and Amina Baraka, his second wife, to conduct interviews about the process of romantic love in the Black radical tradition, and specifically during the era of Black power in America. When I first encountered the couple at the Schomburg Center for Research in Harlem and made my way to the far end of the room to speak with Amina Baraka, I realized that the missing voice was the lesser known Baraka, the singer, poet, sculptor, dancer, mother, wife, and Black revolutionary woman. I arrived at their home in 2013, and Amina Baraka instructed me to wait downstairs so that she could get him. As he made his way down the stairs, his face showed more clearly in the light. He then sat down on the step, and without looking up from tying his shoes, he asked, "How long is this going to take?" I informed him that I was only here to talk to his wife, as she could better narrate the role of women in the organization he led. The tension was palpable. I came to Amina Baraka looking for answers to my questions about how Black women in Newark's Congress of African People balanced their roles as revolutionary women, and wives. We made our way to the front room with the large windows that provided too much light in this home. And Amina Baraka instructed me to call her by her first name. She said, "I'm just Amina." As we set up the recorder, Amir Baraka made his way to the back room, and while the famous man in the back room ate loudly, Amina began to sing as if the clanking of the metal utensil against a ceramic bowl was not a distracting sound. She sang her blues to me. Now, this aforementioned scene evokes a number of provocations about the context in which a blues song permitted the displacement of a celebrated Black man in favor of a less recognizable Black woman. Amina's blues song disrupted her husband's noisiness and moved her voice from the margin to the center. The jagged quality of her singing voice and the instinct that compelled me to tap my foot in rhythm with her breaths on the downbeat evidenced the sonic patterns of the blues in African-American culture. These contexts are the foundation for the code switch in which rank is disordered and further ruptured in the shift from spoken narrative to song, which made Amina's voice central. My endeavor to hear Amina excavated a practice of listening carefully for the ways in which Black women use code switches to express narratives that are neither extraordinary nor ordinary, but both at the same time. When I asked Amina to describe the women in the Congress of African People, she stumbled with these words. I mean, these women were not ordinary. Well, I guess they were ordinary. They were put in a place where they couldn't. Then she found balance in this phrase. They were extraordinary women in a place where they had to become ordinary. So I asked, what is the likelihood that oral history interviews conducted from 2013 to 2018 could serve as a model for hearing Black women's extra/ordinary experiences through the blues? I believe that my conversations with Amina Baraka suggest that such a notion is more than plausible. While the blues tradition is historically situated within the early 20th century, Amina Baraka's performance of blues songs and contemporary oral history interviews reveal a useful model for recovering realistic depictions of Black women's radical praxis within the blues. Furthermore, the performances and life writing of her chosen comrades, Nina Simone and Elaine Brown, similarly demonstrate the utility of the blues for Black women invested in highlighting the ways in which their personal experiences of romantic love, intimacy, and belonging impacted their political organizing. Each of these women used their performances of song and poetry, as well as their life writing, to complicate otherwise singular representations of Black womanhood and the significance of these negotiations. The central line of this investigation is to deepen our engagement with Black women's processes of self-making and dynamic and robust intellectual intersections across multiple genres of Black women's cultural expressions. While the archives of these Black women, life writing and performances consisting of songs, poetry, memoir, interviews, necessitated that I engage in an interdisciplinary and at times undisciplined method of retelling the stories they want to tell, I've found a disciplinary home in literature. Currently, the book project, A House to Sing In, examines the life writing and performances of these three women to challenge dichotomous misrecognition of Black women as either extraordinary or ordinary. With the deployment of the term extra/ordinary, I argue that Black women's complex performances of Blackness, girlhood, womanhood, motherhood, artists, and activists exist in the slash, rather than on either side of the binary between the two. This phenomenon is made legible through blues novels. Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God, Toni Morrison's Sula, and Gail Jones' Carrigadora depict bonded Black women and girls learning the following: conjuring, conforming to and disrupting patriarchal norms, and making use of revision and repetition. I seize upon the aforementioned blues novels and couple them with my close readings of the life narratives and performances of Baraka, Simone, and Brown to interpret their complex negotiations. Together, Baraka and Hurston's Their Eyes Watching God, Simone and Morrison's Sula, and Brown and Jones' Carrigadora permit an exploration of an emancipatory praxis of hearing Black women's negotiations of multiple identities and desires, while highlighting excesses and breaks with regards to gender, sexuality, and patriarchal belonging within Black radical aesthetic traditions. The manuscript's aim is twofold. I challenge the placement of these women's expressions of radical pursuits and affiliations during the civil rights and Black power eras at the forefront of their lives by revealing the origins of their Black radical consciousness and desire for belonging in the homes they resided in as girls, by analyzing the development of their consciousness. Chronologically, I'm able to simultaneously prioritize the extraordinary and the ordinary. Second, I interpret Baraka, Simone, and Brown's life narratives alongside these African-American women's blues novels to highlight the utility of Black women's cultural expression in the blues tradition to intervene in notions of Blackness, kinship, and the domestic space. I frame my narrators as modern blues women building houses with their antecedents tradition of demonstrating seemingly antagonistic positionalities like extraordinary and ordinary as non-contradictory. By studying these three Black women together, I consider the similarities and differences in the houses they carry and the objects to which they're oriented. Thank you for listening. And now I'm going to turn it over to my second year cohort mate, Jamie Parker.
Hi, Janae. Thank you. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you, Janae, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for attending. And especially thank you to Professor Vincent and Professor McDowell, as well as Debbie, James, and Randy for all of your work making this event happen. As Janae said, my name is Jamie Parker. I'm a second year postdoc here at the Woodson Institute, and I'm also the co-convener of the African Studies Colloquium. I came here after getting my PhD in world history at Northeastern University in Boston, where I worked on a very kind of colonial environmental history of Kenya. My dissertation there studied water development in colonial Kenya between roughly the 1930s and independence in '63. But here at the Woodson, I'm now turning this into much more of an African environmental history monograph that is less interested in kind of London decision-making and much more interested in aligning the material and social changes experienced by communities targeted for this kind of water work in northern and eastern Kenya. So while the prevailing historiography of Kenyan development focuses overwhelmingly on the expansion of cash crop production in central and western regions, my work provides an environmental and social history of water denial in eastern and northern Kenya. I argue that water became a site of contestation between rural communities and the economic priorities of the state, and that this contestation coalesced around the conceptual idea of water waste. The book shows that British and post-colonial water development, intentionally in scare quotes, with development being deliberately and kind of, sorry, let me pick that back up. Development in Kenya continuously defined indigenous subsistence and socio-cultural applications of water as inherently wasteful, with the only true application of water instead being towards the creation of agricultural or industrial landscapes. In contrast, however, what appeared to white actors as waste was for indigenous rural, riverine, and pastoral communities a pragmatic array of simultaneously practical, social, spiritual, and cosmological attitudes towards the substance that were and are central to their very essence. So to do this, I look at two distinct case studies in arid regions of Kenya. The first considers the case of the Waso Nyiro River that provides, or at least provided, one of the sole sources of permanent water in the otherwise arid northeastern province. Following the arrival of colonial rule and European settlers in the first 20 years of the 20th century, this river gradually diminished in both flow and extent owing to upstream agriculture introduced by those settlers, who were of course bombastic, wasteful, and incredibly bad at what they were trying to do. The case study examines the place of the river in local environmental philosophies amongst Borana and Somali populations downstream, as well as the material impact that the river's demise imposed upon their pastoral mobility and economies. Further, state attempts to supplement the river through water development projects like boreholes and things like that, in fact, created more rigid ethnic boundaries whilst also critically impinging on particularly Borana prosperity in the region. Further, these new sources were often placed according to political goals rather than ecological conditions, meaning that most of the time they were largely ignored by pastoral communities whose movements rested upon knowledge of cyclical environmental changes and much more granular understandings of the region's grazing for their cattle or their camels. The second case study, on the other hand, considers the Tana River, which is Kenya's longest waterway. These chapters coalesce specifically around the town of Hola, and I show how the river there came to stand in, for colonial officials at least, as a panacea for all forms of irrigation and water development, with officials hoping to turn its apparently wasted potential into an Eden of cash crop production. Predictably enough, this idea of wasted potential was in fact the result of white supremacist and capitalist attitudes towards resource use that erased the presence of the local Pocomo community and the vibrant forms of shifting agriculture and reciprocal trade with outside communities that they engaged in. The introduction of damming and major irrigation projects there and in the post-colonial era thus degraded the physical environment of the Tana Delta whilst also impoverishing surrounding communities in numerous different ways, not solely economic. So methodologically, the use of a source base here that draws on folklore, local eco-philosophies, and poetry alongside petitions or letters to the state from these dispossessed communities allows me to get at some key socio-environmental questions. What does water mean in these regions? How did the colonial instrumentalization of water affect these communities? And how did pastoral or nomadic groups, or indeed riverine groups, respond to widespread changes in rural social and ecological networks? Challenging development in this way rewrites alternative or pre-existing resource relationships on the part of rural indigenous communities back into the historical narrative alongside histories of resilience, and makes clear the social and ecological damage wrought by colonialism in East Africa. While the book is first and foremost a work of history, it is also fundamentally informed by other, more politically verdant approaches such as indigenous ecologies, African eco-philosophy, and the racial capitalist, which force historians to really consider the utility of our work for fostering and extending global forms of anti-capitalist and anti-racist environmental justice, as these same forms of violence and dispossession are reinscribed in the present by governments, by NGOs, and by kind of foreign benefactors as well. Over the next year, I'm hoping to finish up some last research on this in Nairobi, as well as finishing actually writing the thing. But a bunch of this work has been or soon will be published in a variety of African and environmental history journals. I'm incredibly excited to continue this work here at the Woodson alongside such an amazing group of colleagues over the next year. And on that note, I'm absolutely delighted to hand this thing over to our next speaker, Dr. Nicole Ramsey.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Good afternoon. First, I do want to thank the Woodson Institute. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be here and share my work and just bask in this research element with my colleagues. So again, my name is Nicole Ramsey and I'm a first-year postdoc. And my book project is called Sub Umbra Floreo, which translates to Under the Shade I Flourish, Performing the Belizean Nation. And I'm also going to read so that I can keep to the time. So understandings of race and identity in Belize, a former British colony and the only country in Central America where English is the official language, have raised questions as to what category or region the relatively young nation belongs. Belize's status as a Caribbean and Central American country situates the nation, which gained its independence in 1981 as both a multicultural and Black zone within the region, while also serving as a transnational space imbued with varied forms of diasporic Blackness. My project extends current scholarship on Blackness in Central America by examining how Black Belizeans come to see themselves as part of the nation while navigating configurations of identity in the in-between spaces they occupy. Centering two of Belize's dominant African descendant populations, Belizean Creoles and the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna, this project examines how Black Belizeans express Belizean identity through national commemoration, the digital space, visual culture, and everyday articulations of Belizeanness. So drawing on digital ethnography, close readings of popular cultural performances, and participant observation in Belize City and California, I examine how the Belizean nation is made and remade through performances that transcend national boundaries. In addition to exploring how Black Belizeans negotiate their identities transnationally as a result of migration and media, I contend that these transnational and translocal spaces produce a distinctive type of Belizean identity, one that is diasporic, gendered, and always informed by its ambiguous placement in the region. An identity that not only disrupts common perceptions of Blackness and indigeneity in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also entails various forms of self-making and underscore the many negotiations and contradictions of Black Belizean subjectivity. So in using performance theory and Stuart Hall's theories of identity making and cultural identity in the Caribbean as a framework, I build upon Central American, Caribbean scholarship, particularly the works of Deborah Thomas and Shona Jackson and Mimi Scheller, and African diaspora theory to further illustrate the nuanced and imaginative ways that Black Belizeans draw from various archives and diasporic resources in creating a transnational identity that pulls from various locations throughout the diaspora, is perpetually hybrid and ambiguous, and speaks to a very recent colonial past. So the first half of my project is concerned with national and international representations of Belizeanness and identity, as well as competing ideas of post-coloniality. So I take an ethnographic approach to examine how Black Belizeans in Belize City negotiate Belizean national and personal identity through national commemorations, such as September 10th, Independence Day, and Garifuna Settlement Day. I analyze how Black Belizeans utilize these spaces to articulate, perform, and embody Belizean national identity and circum-Caribbean belonging. I also examine the national constructions of the Belizean nation by means of representational politics through a close reading of several commercial and tourist advertisements focused on new media and cultural production that draw on the peculiarities of Belizean ethnic relations and ideals of the nation within the region. The second half of my project turns to the Belizean diaspora and centers migration and transnationalism through the lens of digital media and placemaking in the US. In my analysis of Belizean political forum pages and community photo archives, I argue that these pages and participation in them are used as transnational tools of remembrance, communication, and nostalgia, while serving as an alternative site for articulation. Similarly, Belize in Los Angeles is an important site for Black Central American and Caribbean experiences in the West, and particularly an arena in which Black Belizean identities are negotiated in the context of Black and Brown Los Angeles. Given that roughly 1 out of every 3 Belizeans lives abroad, with the majority residing in Southern California, Belize in Los Angeles encapsulate what Cara Boyce Davies refers to as, quote, Caribbean spaces, stating, quote, these are social and cultural spaces that extend beyond small space and captures ontologically ways of being in the world, end quote. So with my book project, I speak to the common notion that a place like Belize is too Black to be solely Central American and too Indigenous to be solely Caribbean. And my interventions also ask the question of what happens when you insert these into the other and place them into conversation with each other in ways that center the African diaspora, migration, and transnationalism. Oral traditions and storytelling is central to the Belizean identity. And as a second generation myself, I'm inspired, motivated, and come to this work through the stories, oral histories, and lived experiences that are seldom taken up in Belizean historiography and within the region, especially through Black Belizeans and Black women, Black Belizean women. So that's my project in a nutshell. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you all, and I will now turn it over to my colleague, Alexandria Smith.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all for being here, and it's been fantastic to hear everyone's research. Before attending Rutgers University, where I earned my PhD in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, I earned my bachelor's in Comparative Women's Studies from Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. So I am, to my core, a student of Black feminist scholarship. My intellectual interests prioritize the thinking, literary, and artistic creation of Black women and queer people. I study this work using Black feminist and queer theoretical approaches meaning that I am invested in thinking about how ideas of gender, sex, and sexuality inform the lived experiences of Black people, as well as how my interlocutors construct and engage these ideas in their creative work. I am a first-year postdoctoral fellow and will spend my Woodson Fellowship tenure preparing my first book project. The manuscript I am developing is called Sensual Worldmaking: Black Queer Feminist Theorizations of Feeling. In this project, I examine how self-reflective work, including autobiography and autobiographical fiction, personal essays, auto-theory, and visual self-portraiture, draws on lived and embodied experience as a privileged source of theoretical insight. The artistic work created by Black women and queer people has experienced increased visibility and accessibility to general and academic readers since the 1970s, particularly here in the United States. Academic spaces ranging from workshops, conferences, courses, and more recently tenure track lines evidence the increased social awareness of Black creative and intellectual work created by women, queer people, and others who are not cis heterosexual men. Even in light of this increased awareness, there is so much more space for considering the aesthetic and theoretical work that Black queer self-reflection accomplishes. My research draws together Black feminist scholarship on literary criticism, the productive work of feelings and emotions, the importance of embodiment, and the insistence on non-dominant ways of knowing in order to illustrate the kinds of creative self-analysis that Black queer and femme artists undertake. For instance, in Dion Brand's literary works, we encounter the use of first-person narratives through multiple literary genres to aesthetically and theoretically examine the meaning and significance of Black diasporic being. In particular, I read Dion Brand's career-long consideration of the United States invasion of Grenada in 1983, narrated through poetry, essay, fiction, and memoir. While Brand's own embodied experiences of the invasion are relayed in literary form, her use of first-person reflection is capable of mobilizing and extending her own individual experience to put forth analysis of the political and imperial power which shaped that moment and how it continuously ripples into the present. I suggest that at stake in this consideration of Black queer self-reflective work is a renewed understanding of how ourselves, as they move through a world latticed by unequal and destructive power dynamics, are inextricably tied to the process and products of our creativity. In addition to my research and writing, I look forward to exploring these interests with undergraduate students in the Woodson Institute. In the spring, I plan to teach Racing Gender, a course examining how scholarship in Black feminist, Black queer, and Black trans studies approaches the question of the difference that Blackness makes in the theory and practice of gender. Next year, I look forward to teaching a course called Engendering Memoir, which I hope will explore the ways that gender is constructed and discussed in Black autobiographical works. And as others have expressed earlier, I am so grateful for the intellectual and institutional space that the Woodson Institute provides, and I look forward to being in further dialogue with each of you over the next 2 years. And finally, we have Brian Smithson, who earned his PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke University.
Thank you so much, Alexandria, and to everybody at the Woodson who has made my time here in the University of Virginia so incredibly productive, especially Professor Deborah McDowell and Professor Robert Trent Vinson and everybody else. It's really been phenomenally productive for me in helping me rethink my project in interesting new directions. So I wanted to share some slides here, if it will allow me. And let's see here. So as a Woodson Fellow, I've been writing a book about moments such as this one. We're on a Beninese movie set. There are some actors on a couch. There's a Jesus poster on the wall. And there's me off to the side, just out of the camera shot. The book is about the challenges Beninese filmmakers face to get to this point where they're actually able to shoot a movie. The book is called Aesthetics of Praise: Making Movies Religious in Benin. And in this book, I'm answering 3 big questions. The first is, what are the factors that make movie making so difficult in places like Benin? And how do filmmakers there overcome them? The second, why do Beninese creators so often promote indigenous African religions when Christian and Islamic films are usually more lucrative? And number 3, how might grassroots movie making promote African cultural innovations, especially religiously plural ones, as part of a transatlantic decolonial struggle? To answer these questions, I conducted 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork along the southern border of Benin and Nigeria. As you can see on this map, this is a place where most people consider themselves part of a single ethnic group, the Yoruba. It's a region that has played a crucial role in the expansion of global capitalism and race making for 400 years. And it's an area that was an epicenter of the transatlantic slave trade, before it then again suffered under European colonialism when it was divided under British and French colonial rule. My goal was to move beyond previous research on African video film to look less at audience reception or narrative interpretation in favor of looking at movie production itself. Of course, my whiteness, my Americanness made African filmmakers understandably wary of me, but members of a Yoruba filmmaking collaborative known as Kapadi were eager to partner up, provided I could use what I learned to publicize their work widely in my publications, in my talks, and in my classes. They demanded, really, that I let people know about the racist structures that make movie production so difficult in Benin. This collaborative project led to an apprenticeship to 3 veteran video filmmakers as an assistant producer to make the movie you see here, Ikokwatura, or The Jar of Sacred Bliss. Here's the poster for it, and you can actually watch it online at tinyurl.com/Ikokwatura. I also got asked to play white characters in various movies, and I trained in camera work and editing in studios. So based on these direct experiences, I'm arguing in my book that the Nago Yoruba movie makers that I worked with in Benin understand filmmaking according to the aesthetic ideology of indigenous Nago Yoruba religion. This is an ideology that I'm calling a praise aesthetic, a way of showing subjects that invites positive attention from a wide array of constituents. The idea here is to invite positive attention to subjects and in turn encourage ethical relationships with and attention from them. In doing so, Beninese video filmmakers have to reject and undo rival aesthetic regimes from both Africa and the West that have been used to denigrate Black Atlantic religions for centuries. On the one hand, we have Pentecostal Christian movie makers from Nigeria's Nollywood film industry who have used video to expose indigenous religions as supposed trickery, whether by African priests or by the devil himself. This slide here shows a poster from one such movie where you have a heroic pastor character. But these are really very old ideas that trace back to white mission Christianity and to European misinterpretations of African religious objects. The Beninese movie makers I worked with reject these attitudes. Instead, they understand image making as itself an obligation to make worthy subjects appear and to make them appear spectacular. So in the process, these filmmakers and their allies champion something that they call the tradi moderne. This is the Beninese French term for using tradition as a fundamental resource for Africans to participate in modernity on their own terms. The tradi moderne takes the building blocks of Black Atlantic religion and then uses them to rebut racialized global trends that lead to religious division and economic uncertainty. In sum, this is a project about movie making under constraints and the deliberations it enables. These are deliberations that are interreligious, with Christians and Muslims and Olorisha promoting a common tradition together. These are deliberations that are transnational, with Beninese and Nigerians working together with feedback from counterparts in the African diaspora. And these are deliberations that are decolonial, hearkening to distinctly Yoruba political strategies and religious ethics. In short, movie making is a fertile field for African creators to imagine an outside to racial capitalism, and then to create the relationships that might make that imagined outside a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I offered thanks and at the beginning of the program, and it occurred to me that I needed to thank another group of people, and that is the members of the Fellowship Selection Committee over the last 2 or 3 years that brought you all here, that said, you are the folk who should come. It's truly a gift and a blessing to have you here amongst us. I'm so happy. It's extraordinary to have you here. Without going any further into that, I would say that we are at 5:30, which is a little after 5:30. And James Perla put in the chat, for anyone in the audience who has a question, comment, either you can put that in the chat or you can raise the question yourself verbally. And so we can stay on for a little longer. If our fellows can stay for a little longer, if there are questions, please feel free. And James will moderate the chat.
So please feel free as well to use the raise hand function down at the bottom of your screen. I'll be able to signal you to give you the capability to talk just via audio only. And of course, you can also use the chat function below. A lot to take in. There's some really great presentations. So thanks to all the fellows for taking the time to present your research. It was very stimulating. The thanks are rolling in the chat, so. There was a reference to thanking Jillian for the Clyde Woods reference. So that is good. To get the ball rolling, I may take the liberty to ask a question, if that's okay with folks. I wanted to ask ask Janae about the oral history moment that you presented, which was really lovely, the thing that you sketched out right at the beginning of your remarks. And I wanted to just ask about kind of, if you talk about the sort of politics of the interviewing process and perhaps how your oral history methodology sort of interacts with the kind of tradition of oral history or even audio storytelling. And the example there is just, you know, other people in that moment might have said to Amiri Baraka, you know, hey, we need perfect silence in this room, so please vacate to allow us to speak in you know, kind of studio-like settings. So maybe, you know, if you could talk about your approach, because I think that's a really rich piece of information you extract that is made possible by a kind of oral history approach that is less kind of top-down, hierarchical, and more open to chance, perhaps.
Well, what I like about this question is that my dog started barking while you were talking. So speaking of interruptions, you know, when I started doing this work, I didn't really know what I was doing. I had just graduated from undergrad, and I had this awesome position working with these great oral historians at Columbia's Oral History Master's Program. Mary Marshall Clark is still there, Amy Starczewski is still there. And I realized that there may be something unique about the fact that I was interviewing women that I call Black revolutionary women because they identify as revolutionaries. And they were active during a very particular time in the 50s, 60s, and 70s where their phones were tapped and there were all kinds of issues of very legitimate paranoia. And so the one thing I knew I wanted to do was make them as comfortable as possible. And what that looked like was letting them choose the place where we would do the interviews. And they often said their homes, and their homes were often filled with other people. And so the space of the home became a really significant aspect of my research and how I was thinking through what Black womanhood means in the domestic space. And so in that moment, in the vignette that I share, where Amiri Baraka is in the back room, making quite a bit of noise, I realized that the conversation wasn't necessarily between me, the oral historian, and Amina Baraka, my interviewee. It was also between a husband and a wife. And they were having a really layered conversation that had nothing to do with me, and yet I was there witnessing it. So rather than dismissing that moment or ignoring it, it kind of helped me better understand what this project was doing that maybe other projects that I was really passionate about and read and loved didn't really consider. Dealing with the kind of challenges of patriarchal belonging and patriarchal love and what it means to have this kind of traditional marriage with all of its little ruptures. So that moment of rupture in the interview felt really significant for me. And it came up in other interviews that I did with other women, and we kind of learned to play with it. I always reference Toni Morrison playing in the dark. So much of the work of Black Studies is about figuring it out as you go. And I didn't want to leave anything out or ignore anything that was happening. So that moment in the vignette was very real. And as a 23-year-old researcher, I wasn't fully sure what to do, but I just decided we were going to let the tapes roll and I would figure it out later. And here we are, about 8 years later, and things are starting to make more sense to me about why that is useful. But full honesty, in that moment, I did not know what to do.
Great, thank you so much for that question. We had a question for that response, sorry. We had a question come in from Brian Foster, who said, many of you are working at the fault lines / boundaries between disciplines, fields of studies, genres, mediums, etc. Zalika, I'm thinking of your work. Alexandria, yours too, and other folks too. I'm wondering if you all could talk about the value or perhaps the challenges of working in between these different spaces. So that's an open question to folks.
For sure. Ryan, thank you so much for the question. So I think one of the things that I try to center in this work is just the value of being within the discipline of Black Studies. I'm a person that did undergrad in Black Studies, my MA in Black Studies, and now pursuing a PhD in Black Studies. So it's very interesting to think about the ways and how Black Studies is interdisciplinary, but it's also a discipline within itself, which I think is something that people tend to overlook by sometimes emphasizing the interdisciplinary nature. So with that understanding, I also think about I think there's a lack of boundary that I appreciate about Black Studies. I think that there's a formless nature to it. So that's something that I really, really wanted to engage in my own work and understanding how to move in and out of, Black queer studies and Black trans studies. And one of the latest, I think most important interventions for me has been Black porn and sex work studies, especially with scholars such as, Dr. Murray Miller-Young. Someone earlier, one of the fellows mentioned Dr. Ariane Cruz, Dr. Jennifer Nash. These are some of the people that come to mind when I think about that form of study. But methodologically, Black Studies has so much to offer when we're thinking about how we want to engage in method as we're thinking about the epistemologies of Black Studies as well. So I thought it was very important, though, as I am very, very staunchly Black Studies, to engage anthropological methods as well. And so what did it mean to engage in anthropological methods such as research creation with a sort of Black Studies foci or focus? I took a course a few years ago called the Critical Practices of Making with Dr. Craig Campbell, who is an experimental anthropologist. And what was so useful is every week or so, or every other week, we did what was known as an obstruction. So every week we were literally tearing our projects apart artistically and through scholarly creation to make new meaning of our work. And I felt that it was important with each and every last chapter. One of the things that you'll notice is that I tried to, as an artist, incorporate those creative components and of course the academic components. And so you'll notice that there's a dipping in and out of discourses of shame, pleasure, desire. But what I also try to do is in one of the chapters, particularly the fourth one, which is on the death of Islam Nettles, the Black trans woman in 2013, who was unfortunately murdered by a Black cis man. I treat that chapter as a form of elegy within itself. So each and every last chapter has an engagement with my artistic making as well. But that was the particular chapter where instead of using performance, I decided to engage a poetics instead. I decided to look at her selfies as its own image making, look at her selfies as its own form of self-portraiture, engage her as an artist instead and recognize her as such. So I think that the challenge though is with being formless, there are so many possibilities, but I think that's where the value is. So I hope that that makes sense.
I mostly want to just let your answer sit because I think you put it so beautifully. And of course, I experience a lot of parallels as someone trained into gender studies departments. And those are interdisciplinary fields, but they are also their own fields of study with their own histories. And what resonates in what you're saying, Zalika, is the way that you are being, that you are drawing our attention to your intention in crafting the project. So you are engaging artistic work, but you are also aware of your decisions as an artist with a set of intellectual and political orientations. And there are, of course, many multi and interdisciplinary fields, but what I've really appreciated about both Black studies and gender or feminist studies is the way that the orientation of those fields encourage you, at least in my experience, to draw from as many places as possible in order to answer the question, because they're posing questions about how knowledge and experience are constructed or constituted. The place that you pull the answer from doesn't need to be limited. Yeah, I'll stop there, but that's a great question and a great answer.
Thank you.
I second those comments. Those were put really beautifully.
James, did you have, there was something in the chat about, did you all have questions for each other?
I'm sorry to interrupt.
There are a lot of intersections and connections, right? And you may have already had many of these conversations, but just listening over the past 90 minutes, you may have many questions or comments for each other. We can stay as long as we are able. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to make a few comments. So I was super excited to hear a lot of connections between my research and Janae's and Zalika's and Lexi's. And Matthew, it was great to hear more about your work too, and the way that you engage like found objects in order to understand how enslaved people made meaning of their lives and established their personhood. It made me think of an essay by Toni Morrison. It's called Moral Inhabitants. And this is not anything that I'm suggesting in the scope of your project, but it just might interest you based on your research interest, because it's a short essay and it's in that collection that was released, I think just before she passed away, The Source of Self-Regard. But in it, she begins her essay with this ledger from 18 something, where a number of enslaved persons were listed beside turpentine and, you know, leather and other goods. So that made me think of your work, and that might be interesting to you. And Janae, when I was listening to you unpack this dichotomy between the ordinary and the extraordinary, and when I was listening to you tease out the what I feel like and what I think about in my own work as the actual lived experience of people who we either Black women who are either mythologized or who are lost to obscurity. I thought about a talk that Kathleen Collins did at Howard in the 80s. And she, the quote that I can remember of it is that she, you know, being human is the one thing that's denied to Black people, because in order to reject, of course, the stigma of centuries, the impulse is to mythologize ourselves and to make ourselves into superheroes or superhuman. So your work, disrupting that boundary, made me think of it. And I have the link somewhere. I'll send it to you. It might interest you based on what you write about. And that was all. No real question, just things that your works made me think of, and hopefully that you will find interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I'm definitely going to look that up as soon as we get off Zoom. So thank you so much.
Any other questions, comments? Nice haircut, Matt, by the way. Different look for you. All right. Anything else? No? Going once, going twice? Okay. All right. Well, we can wrap here. This has been wonderful. Again, this has been wonderful to hear all of your presentations and to be able to talk with each other. I look forward to doing it many, many, many more times going forward. Just as a reminder for us, really, we'll start our workshop schedule every other week, starting next Wednesday with Jillian McCommons, and the interlocutor will be JT Rohn. So we'll see each other again, fellows and faculty, next Wednesday. James, unless we have anything else, any other questions that come in? No? Nothing? Okay. All right. Well, let us pause. And after all of this wonderful conversation, I'm sure folk are hungry, probably ready for dinner and for some relaxation. And so thank you again. And I will say good evening to everyone and look forward to seeing the fellows next Wednesday. Be well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.